Hi there. Welcome to my presentation. This narrated slideshow is designed for those of you who are new to autoethnography as a research method, just like I was only a couple of years ago. Today, I'm going to focus on the topic of data organization, using my very recent work on a PhD dissertation as an example. I happen to be a registered dietitian since 2003, and I'm now a fourth-year doctoral student at Teachers College, Columbia University. The topic that I'm interested in is historical intergenerational trauma and how it can impact eating behavior. For this project, I'm using my own life history as a source of data, and there's quite a lot of data for me to draw from, and so I've called this presentation Growing Up with Holocaust Survivors, Strategies for Managing Complex Data Collection for an Autoethnography on Eating Behavior. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was raised along with an older brother in New York City by my parents, as well as my maternal grandmother, who lived with us throughout my entire childhood. All three adults in my life were Jewish Holocaust survivors from Poland who lost their entire immediate family members during the war. My father survived 4 concentration camps and endured years of forced labor. My mother and grandmother escaped near starvation conditions in the Krakow ghetto and went into hiding under assumed identities until the end of the war. When the war ended, my mother and my grandmother went back to their native city of Krakow, and my mother ended up growing up in Poland in the 1940s and 1950s under the Soviet system, in which the supply of food was heavily rationed. So, for me, growing up in the 1970s and 80s in New York, in a family that endured such atrocities, certainly had its difficulties, particularly in the ways trauma had played out in the day-to-day communication styles and parenting behavior revolving around food. As a consequence, during my middle school and high school years, I developed maladaptive eating and exhibited food avoidance behaviors. These issues, I'd like to stress, were not related to weight or body image, but rather they were issues related to fear about being controlled and micromanagement, having feelings of nervousness and annoyance at being obligated to eat at an event or gathering, and basically feeling that shopping, cooking, and even eating in and of itself was an intrusion on my life. As these thoughts and ideas about food followed me into my college years and early 20s, it coincided with an emerging issue with anxiety and depression, which was very debilitating for me. However, I did manage to get some excellent help through therapy, and eventually I came to realize that food can be your friend. This was a very, very important realization for me to make and set the stage up for my next endeavor, which was to start reading and researching as much as I could about human health and nutrition, only to discover, happily, that nutrition science is an incredibly interesting field that I've stuck with ever since. So, in order to deal with all my difficult issues, I put myself on a mission to heal myself and also help others. So, starting in 1999 and until 2003, I trained to become a registered dietitian and earned a master's degree in clinical nutrition. From then on, I worked in hospitals, outpatient clinics, some private practice, and eventually I began teaching as an adjunct professor at various colleges and universities, which I have been doing for more than 15 years. Then, in 2021, at the age of 51, I entered a PhD program at Teachers College, Columbia University, specifically their behavioral nutrition program, and came up with the idea of doing an autoethnography for my doctoral dissertation. So the working title of my dissertation is Maladaptive Eating Behavior and Intergenerational Trauma, an autoethnographic exploration of food meaning and enmeshment within a family system of first, second, and third generation Holocaust survivors. My expected proposal hearing will take place in spring 2025. So I needed to come up with a theoretical framework for my doctoral thesis. So in doing the research, I came across a researcher, Natan Kellerman, who wrote something about intergenerational trauma that immediately resonated with me. And I put it on the slide. He notes, unconscious and conscious transmission of parental traumatization always takes place in a certain family environment, one that is characterized by a highly closed family system in which parents or grandparents become overly involved and intrusive, tend to enmesh their offspring in the crossfire of their own emotional problems, and bind their children unto themselves in a manner that makes it difficult for the children to gain independence. With this concept in mind, and knowing that it certainly applies to my situation, I came up with two theoretical frameworks that I wanted to further investigate to better understand the psychosocial mechanisms through which trauma can be transmitted in a family system. So the first framework is based upon the Bowen family systems theory, which basically asserts that the nuclear family of origin is comprised of members who are emotionally interdependent, and there are several avenues through which trauma can be transmitted intergenerationally. The other framework that I am investigating is Minuchin's theory of enmeshment, which basically is a family dynamic characterized by blurred personal boundaries and relationships that hamper autonomy. Based on my own experience and the literature that I have reviewed up till now, both of these systems and theories make a lot of sense as it applies to the topic I'm trying to explore. So these two frameworks and my research thus far has led me to ask these four research questions for my dissertation. How do second and third generation Holocaust survivors experience significant inheritance of intergenerational trauma within a closed family system via interpersonal communication involving food and eating behavior? What are the predominant characteristics of this interpersonal communication and the underlying mechanisms of transmission? How do these characteristics relate to parental feeding style, particularly behaviors that fall under the scope of enmeshment? And finally, how can we apply this knowledge to assisting individuals with maladaptive eating behavior that stems from the consequences of historical intergenerational trauma? So in trying to tackle these research questions and doing an autoethnography, I of course have to delve into the artifacts that are available to me. And there are certainly quite a few. There are historical documents that basically document or offer context for the primary trauma that had occurred for my mother, grandmother, and father, archived official testimony that I have access to, family photos, clips from home movie footage that basically capture the point I'm trying to make, audio recordings, past personal writing belonging to myself and other family members, and photos that I've taken of symbolic keepsakes that really capture the essence of what I'm trying to communicate. It's a lot of material to draw from. And just to give you an example of what I actually have with respect to historical documents, let's say, I have my grandmother's registration and resettlement documents from Nazi-occupied Poland, which offer documentation of the situation that she was in that ultimately led to her confinement in the Krakow ghetto. In terms of archived official testimony, I have my father's 2.5 hour 1995 Holocaust survivor video testimony, which is accessible to the public and archived at the University of Southern California's Shoah Foundation, which, by the way, has more than 50,000 such videotaped oral testimonies available now for researchers. I have family photos, for example, from the 1970s depicting interactions between me and my grandmother with respect to the feeding practices I'm trying to describe. I have clips from home movie footage that also offers similar images of what I had experienced. I have audio recordings, for example, a 1994 interview I did with my grandmother in which she describes the near starvation conditions that she endured as well as my mother endured in the Krakow ghetto. I have past personal writings, for example, a 1987 essay that I wrote for my college applications that described the nature of my relationship between myself and my grandmother, information that is pertinent to the study that I'm doing. And I have photos of important keepsakes that capture or symbolize the difficulties or the contradictions I realize occurred in the environment that I grew up in. As you know, autoethnography also draws upon writing material that you engage in and create throughout the course of the study, because writing is the primary method of inquiry in autoethnography. So we have two broad categories in terms of this type of writing. We have the personal journal, which is intended to be a source of self-reflection, and we also have field notes, which are intended to be a little bit more distant and self-observational. So I wanted to go over with you what are the distinctions. In autoethnography, as we know, both personal journals and field notes can be used to collect data, but they serve slightly different purposes. A personal journal is meant to be introspective and subjective. It could be written very spontaneously, thoughts, emotions, reflections, and feelings. It can be used as a tool for self-exploration and better understanding the emotional impact and personal impact that your research has. It can capture very deep reflections on personal events, your feelings about the process, and it also tends to have a much more informal tone than, say, your field notes. Field notes, on the other hand, are more focused on observations of the external world, your interactions with people and events. They're intended to document your observations of your surroundings, your interactions, and the contexts that are relevant to the study. They should capture your reactions and your interpretations of these external events, but in comparison with a personal journal, they're supposed to be a little bit more distant. Therefore, field notes are a tool for grounding the research in real-world context and connecting your personal experience to whatever broader social or cultural phenomenon you want to discuss. So as you can see, they both serve very important purposes, but they are slightly different, even though both of them are subjective forms of research and observation. So I had to think very carefully about how I wanted to approach writing the field notes. With respect to autoethnography specifically, there's actually not a whole lot of information on how to construct field notes in a very step-by-step manner. There is quite a lot of information out there on how to do ethnography when you are trying to do a research study on a group or a culture that is not about yourself. But given that this is an autoethnography, I had to come up with a method that was comfortable and doable for me and that works well with what my topic is. So what I did is I created a template for myself using a Word document, and I came up with the headings that you see here. So today's date, meaning the date that I am actually composing the field note, the date of the event, which may not be the same date that I'm actually creating the note, the location, the occasion, who were the participants, if any, aside from myself, a description of what went on, and then what captured my attention about this event or interaction. Why did it capture my attention? What did I discover or conclude about it? And what do I think needs further exploration? So I included here, just for added clarification, a condensed version of a field note that I recently wrote, just to give you an idea of the types of information I included here. So the day that I wrote this field note was January 1st, 2025, the first day of the new year, not a bad date to begin with. And it was about an event that took place a few days prior, December 27th. What was the location or the occasion? It was a holiday family gathering at my mother's apartment. My mother, by the way, is 85 years old. So what happened during this event, or what specific interaction took place? So in my field note, I included the fact that my brother, sister-in-law, my nephew, my son, my daughter, and husband and mother were all present. And the description of the event was one in which I was in the kitchen with my mother getting a side dish ready to bring into the dining area. Well, what captured my attention about this particular interaction? Well, it happened to be that my mother was quite annoyed and impatient with me because of how I went about spooning rice that she had cooked on her stove into a serving bowl. She was annoyed and impatient because she disagreed with what I chose to complete this task. I wanted to use a metal spoon and she wanted me to use a wooden spoon. Sounds pretty trivial. All of us go through all sorts of tense interactions with their families. There's nothing special or new about that idea, but I wanted to just take this one seemingly trivial moment and explain in a field note why it was relevant. It was relevant because at that moment, emotionally, I felt a sharp and immediate sense of aggravation because that interaction reminded me of her take charge behavior throughout my childhood around meal preparation and her insistence that I follow her directions very, very specifically. So this definitely delves into or touches upon issues that I had to come to grips with and want to discuss as part of a whole story or narrative about my experiences growing up in a household where control and micromanagement was a big, big feature of life surrounding food. So what did I discover or conclude from this one small interaction that recently took place? I discovered that my reaction even now reinforces my long-held perception that scenarios involving food prep and consumption are somehow equated with lack of personal freedom and being controlled. What needs further exploration? It really hit me hard, even now, even recently, that I've devoted a great deal of attention in the past of thinking about and discussing my grandmother's role in how food was handled and my emerging attitudes about food, but I didn't think as much about my mother's role, because generally speaking, my mother was quite hands off when it came to how much I ate or what I ate, but actually quite controlling when it came to food preparation. And I didn't think about it as much up until now. So this was a very important realization for me. In this next slide, I just wanted to show you what the field note actually looks like. I have other field notes that are much longer than this, but I thought this would be a good example for just the purposes of this presentation. So, writing on autoethnography, as we all know, involves a time-consuming, multi-step research process that integrates information from the past with knowledge and perspectives culled from the present. So there are a lot of challenges in trying to take a project on like this that involves so many different pieces of data. For me, the challenge is, how do I organize a large variety of data sources, historical documents, multimedia interviews, personal photos, previous writing samples, text messages, emails, symbolic family keepsakes, journal entries, and field notes. All these things that collectively come from widely different times and places. So in thinking about this, I decided one approach is to make note of 3 distinct time frames for this project, but time frames that obviously overlap. The first time frame refers to the very distant past, in which my parents and grandmother experienced the primary trauma, starting in 1939 with the beginning of World War II. The second time frame is the less distant past, in which I experienced the secondary trauma. This covers my childhood, teen years, and early adulthood, starting from the year I was born, 1970. And then you have this third time frame, the more recent years, which covers the beginning of my doctoral studies and autoethnographic research, which was 2021. But then you can say that there is a fourth time frame here, starting from 2004, one that covers my own parental feeding practices with the birth of my children, which took place in 2004. They're twins. So my parental feeding practices could be examined, behaviors and communication style that may or may not have transmitted tertiary trauma to my son and daughter, who are now aged 20. So how could I go about organizing all these sources of data from multiple time frames? So I came up with the following system. I would create 7 main folders on my laptop and entitle them as illustrated here. Folder number 1 would be primary trauma for my father, primary trauma regards to my mother, primary trauma grandmother. Then I have two folders related to secondary trauma, one folder for myself as the researcher, and then another one for my brother. And then the final two folders relate to tertiary trauma, one for my son, one for my daughter. And possibly I will create more, one for my niece, one for my nephew. So then I moved on to creating subfolders and then subfolders. And it looks like this. A lot of folders, but every piece of information will have a home, which makes it very easy to find. So starting with the primary trauma folder for my father, then I would have a subfolder for the audio cassette recordings I have of him, and I have two sets. I have one that's in English, which gets a folder of its own, and I have one in Yiddish, which gets yet another folder. Then I have a subfolder for the movie clips, a subfolder for photos that relate to him specifically, a folder for before the war and a folder for after the war. I have another folder for his handwritten letters. Then I have another folder for his official documents, and then the subfolders, official documents related to Poland, official documents related to Germany, official documents related to the United States, and so on and so forth. And as I go through all these folders, I see that there is now a place really for everything. And all these folders are going to have either scanned versions of documents or photos of certain documents. And with respect to my mother, I have all sorts of spontaneous iPhone videos done either by my daughter or by me. iPhone interviews that we did in Germany, iPhone interviews we did in Israel, iPhone interviews we did when we visited Krakow, and so on and so forth. I have folders for post-war. I have folders for personal writing with respect to emails or her handwritten letters or her text messages. All of a sudden, organizing all this material seems doable. And then, of course, we have the secondary trauma folder, and room for personal writing, room for text messages, again, home movie clips, pictures of keepsakes, and so on and so forth. So as of right now, I have 60 or so folders, subfolders, and subfolders. And given that autoethnography is a highly iterative research method, of course, it goes without saying that some of these folders may be eliminated or renamed, and other folders are going to be added. So it will be a wait and see situation to finally observe how this all shakes out. But at least I now have a working approach to organizing an overwhelming amount of information. In addition, what I do have planned is to find someone who can be an interviewer for my dissertation, someone who would be able to ask really excellent questions and follow-up questions of myself, my son, my daughter, my brother, my niece, and my nephew. And then I will have access to these interview transcripts whereby I could do further analysis. So what will this data analysis look like with all this information, including the interview transcripts? Well, one idea that I came up with is to take a thematic approach. And these are relational themes with respect to food, behavior, and family dynamics. I came up with 9 relational themes thus far based on all the literature reviewing I've done. So the 9 are power struggles, assertion of independence, enmeshment, barriers to individuation, cultural, religious, and ritualistic paradoxes, communicating fear of impending danger, the simultaneous knowing and not knowing about the primary trauma, needing to make up for parental trauma, perception of parents' vulnerability, being the transparent child, meaning parents see right past you, fear of not being understood, post-memory behavior, feeling as though your parents' memories are somehow your own memories, and then the influence of gender roles. I came up with these themes based upon what has been written over several decades about Holocaust survivors and their offspring specifically. So, looking ahead, I have a lot of data organization yet to do and data analysis to jump into. And we know that data analysis begins while data collection is still in progress. So really, I've already started my data analysis. And as we know, performing this data analysis facilitates yet more questions and yet more collection of data based on what you've observed and concluded and decided requires further exploration, which is why these field notes are so very, very helpful. So for the next few months, I'm going to continue to collect and organize my information using the approaches I've just outlined for you. And I am gearing up over these next few months to write the first 3 chapters of my dissertation in preparation for my proposal hearing. So there will be, as traditionally expected, an introduction, an extensive literature review, and a methods section, which will likely incorporate a lot of the ideas I've shared with you today. So creating this presentation for this IANI conference was enormously helpful to me. And I hope for those of you who are watching this and are new to autoethnography, I really, really hope that this gave you some idea on how you can approach your own projects. And we all know no 2 projects are exactly alike, obviously, but we can certainly share ideas on how best to tackle an enormous amount of information. Here is the bibliography I've included, which helped me create these slides and come up with ideas to share with you today. And if anyone would like to get in touch with me, please do so. I certainly welcome questions and constructive feedback, and I can be reached at my email at Teachers College. So thanks so much for listening to this, and best of luck.